Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa, and this is a video on radical neuroconstructivism. I teach a course at Harvard University at the Extension School and the Summer School called the Neuroscience of Learning, an Introduction to Mind, Brain Health, and Education. I'm an associate editor at Nature Partner Journal Science of Learning, and I'm co-founder of Conexiones, the learning science platform. Today, we're going to just have 3 items on the agenda. We're going to look at this big word, radical neuroconstructivism, and break it down into its 3 parts. We're going to begin at the end. So we're going to talk about constructivism, then we're going to talk about the neuro elements, which include the networks, and then radical in the sense of being dynamic and ever-changing. We're going to then try to apply this into your classroom. What does this mean for teacher education? This video is based off of an article I wrote with Cynthia Borja. So the key idea was to remind readers that the main element in quality education is the quality teacher. But teachers don't normally get information about the brain. And around that, we also looked at holons, something that is simultaneously a part as well as a whole. And this is one way to look at teacher education. We have lots of parts that pull together the whole of our general teacher understanding about how our practice should work. And I think there's at least 4 big pieces to that. In this really nice sweet spot in the center here is where we think teacher education really should take place, where there's a lot of good information, not only about what to teach, how to teach it, leveraging tools to teach it, but also an understanding about human learning in general and how the brain works. The idea of radical neuroconstructivism itself comes from the fields of psychology, educational psychology, a lot of Piaget's work, which looked at the fundamental structure of how knowledge building occurs in the brain, how people construct their own knowledge based on the realities around them. And the results of this good radical neuroconstructivism is that people are achieving meaning making. They understand their world around them. They're able to build off of lower level concepts to get to higher level understandings about things. They're able to interact with people on the level of concepts as well as emotional states. So meaning making is a good result of what happens when we have radical neuroconstructivism. And all of this is really necessary because we know that learners come to class on an uneven playing field due to their genetic makeup and early life experiences. So to try to facilitate a teacher's better understanding of what's going on in the brain, we think of this in terms of learning trajectories. And this is typically what happens when you have a well-executed curriculum structure. You go from lower level concepts up to higher level concepts. The key idea here is that if we miss anything, any core notion at any one of those levels, the student will not be able to achieve the highest ability of learning. We oftentimes may find it necessary to rush through a curriculum point because of time. We don't have enough time to really go into depth, and some kids might not really be grasping some of these core notions before we move them on. You might have a kid who sort of appears to maybe get addition, but won't know it's time to get on to subtraction. And if we move on to higher order concepts before they have a strong foundation, they won't have that firm base upon which they can build new knowledge. The main contribution of radical neuroconstructivism to education is that we now associate these key foundational pieces of knowledge, these trajectories, these natural learning trajectories, with key neural networks. Sensory perception or physiology, context in which one lives, general cognition, as well as domain-specific cognition. Those branch out into dozens of different types of pathways. And so breaking this down into its smaller parts, maybe holonic thinking, right? Breaking down the brain into very small parts helps us understand in general how learning occurs in the brain. So if we use these 4 basic networks, we realize that kids have to have at least 3 to 5 senses going to work well, to be able to learn well. So hearing, sight, and touch are basics, and we oftentimes find that some kids in school may not be doing well not because they don't get the concept, but because they can't see or hear well enough. And so these are key elements to sort of weed out beforehand to make sure that we are scaling up interventions as opposed to just jumping to conclusions that the kid might have a learning difficulty. We also know that things that are related to a child's context, where they grow up, and what types of cultural norms exist, has a huge influence on their learning outcomes as well. And how they relate to their teachers, how their native language is seen, how their own self-esteem is impacted by their placement within the school. All of these things have an influence on learning outcomes. And then what has most been studied about the brain is general cognition, how the influence of memory and attention, or executive functions, which is really broken down, it's really memory systems and attention systems, how that influences learning outcomes. There's a much more literature in this particular space than in all the others combined. But then when we start to get into domain-specific areas, we can see how math or language, for example, have also distinct neural networks for different things like symbols as compared with orders or patterns or relationships or categories. And so domain-specific neural networks are very distinct and just now beginning to be studied. When we look at children who might have mathematical difficulties, for example, what types of difficulties could occur and how does this manifest itself in a physical sense of not having those neural connections made appropriately before the child moves on to higher order concepts. And in the article, if you take the time to look at it, these are all hyperlinked to some of the studies that have to do with some of these early networks that need to be formed. For example, when a child is learning to count or comparing and ordering or reorganizing or coding information or looking at forms or design or terms of magnitude or measurement or ordinality, all of these things are different, although sometimes overlapping neural networks in the brain. And so understanding how we can break down math, for example, into distinct parts allows us a greater ability to intervene in a more precise way. And just instead of saying he has a math problem, if we know that his real problem has to do with ordinality or with magnitude understanding or comparing symbols to magnitude and aligning those things, then our interventions can be much more precise. And we can see this breakdown within language as well as within math, right? Things like receptive language versus productive language, vocabulary building, storytelling. These types of things are running distinct neural networks in the brain, which is why they have to be rehearsed in their own time if we want the kid to have language writ large, right? If they're missing any one of these single elements, they may look like they don't get the overall objectives. If their spelling is bad, or if they don't read fluently, if their handwriting seems to be off, or writing itself is very hard to generate and process. These things are very distinct neural networks, and they need to be taught to teachers in a way that they can actually use this as leverageable and usable knowledge. So in this basic breakdown, things that teachers are quite aware of is we talk about different cognitive domains. We talk about language and math, for example, as two huge areas. And we also see that there's a lot of observable behavior we're asked to sort of measure, looking at different standards we might have, right? The child can sound out the word based on the phonetic understanding, okay? But what's going on in the brain between just this overall goal of language and this one single ability? There's a whole lot of other things going on when we break down language into, what are we talking about? Okay, we're talking about reading, not writing or speaking or listening. We're just talking about reading. And what does that mean? Well, that breaks down into things like word recognition and spelling and intonation and dozens of other things. But word recognition itself also can be broken down into semantic recall as well as phonemic recognition and fluency and all these other things. And so there's multiple networks and subnetworks and subpathways for each of these observable behaviors. So when we're talking about a child having a language problem, that's not a helpful thing. What we need to become is more precise in understanding really what networks have not been rehearsed enough so that that kid can then shore up those missing skills and then build up that constructivist trajectory towards the learning goal. And in terms of math, this is something, again, here's some observable behavior. You can see the kid does 1 + 2 = 3. They're conceptualizing it one way, but they have to be able to see, touch, hear. They have to be able to execute memory and attention, executive functions to do that. We also have to take into consideration how motivation and self-esteem and the relationships with everybody else in the classroom have an influence on that ability to learn. And all of that serves as the basic foundation upon which you can then have domain-specific learning, which are specific neural networks that have to do with number sense, symbols, patterns, order, categories, and relationships. And each one of these, in turn, breaks down into other sub networks. When we look at number sense, well, how does that break down? Symbol systems, patterns, order, categories, relationships. These are some examples of distinct neural networks and studies that have been done in these sub elements. And so this is one of the key reasons that neuroscientists and educators have a hard time talking to each other, is that neuroscientists are really working at a very, very micro level of a specific sub-skill of what a teacher will label math, for example. And so understanding these many elements and understanding how a breakdown in any single one of them can actually throw a wrench into understanding how to do basic addition is very helpful to teachers, because when they understand all these sub-elements, then the curriculum makes a lot more sense. And it's very easy then to realize what the student may be missing and what may be causing learning difficulties. Go back to this idea of neuroconstructivism. What is this constructivism based off of? It's one of these many different theories of learning. We have humanist theories or behaviorist theories or cognitive theories. Well, constructivist theories of learning are one type of learning theory, how humans learn. And all of this goes back, back a couple centuries actually, to Dewey and Montessori and Piaget and Vygotsky and Brunner. And von Glaserfeld is one of the first to talk about a radical constructivism, how our brains are changed by interaction with the other. What's so special about von Glaserfeld's contributions is that everybody was sort of looking at kids and individual human brains and sort of thinking about this brain out of context. And he really decided to put it back into context. When you're in a classroom setting, when you're in this dynamic social exchange that happens, we know that other people influence our learning. How we hear about things, how we see somebody get praised for getting a right answer, how somebody's wrong answer is treated within a classroom structure, how people are motivated to continue to learn even if they get things incorrect, how students teach each other, not just how the teacher teaches the class. All of those things involve an exchange between human beings that occurs in the classroom. And so in taking his idea, we build off this idea that all learning, yes, it's constructivist. An individual is constructing their own learning, but this happens in a social context. Now let's shift into the neuro aspect of constructivism. So neuroconstructivism is a theoretical framework in which we use to talk about how the brain is constructed. Theories of neuroconstructivism and how humans learn have been around since about the late 1990s. And they were initially used to point out when something was missing, in understanding when a child might have a deficit in something, what was missing. And so they might have several pieces, but if you're pulling out the scaffolding on certain core elements, then they don't have what's needed to build higher order concepts out of that. And so understanding these basic neural pathways has become a new focus in the early 2000s. And so beginning to look at what are the core networks that need to be in place before you can build upon them, have an understanding of something like how to read, and then expand on that knowledge to have additional knowledge is a rather new type of learning theory that's just come about, let's say 2006, 7, 10, more or less is the start of all of this. And so this is all based on the idea that all new learning passes through the filter of prior experiences, that what you know influences what you can know, and that the more you know, the more you can know, basically based on these network theories. And so every time a synapse occurs and different neurons are connecting, you get additional dendrites that stem from that, and those can then attach to other things. And so we know that the more you know, the more you can know, literally speaking. The more you know, the more you've connected things, actually creates the opportunity for additional connections. We are seeing how making these connections in the brain, how building these neural networks is actually a reflection of what we hope is good curriculum and pedagogical structure, and getting this hierarchy of learning in place to be able to learn higher order concepts. And one of the best illustrations of that are research and studies coming out of the Conexiones project, which I hope you get a chance to have a look at online. We now see these networks that have to be in place before certain behaviors can be observed in students. And so seeing how things connect, don't connect, seeing where disturbances occur has been very valuable in helping teachers see the physical underpinnings of learning. And some examples of the networks, remember we mentioned all of these 4 different types of networks. If you have a problem with general cognition, you have a problem with all learning. Sorry. If you have problems with memory and attention, you're going to have problems in all subject areas. But sometimes these are functioning fine, but you do have some problems in domain-specific areas. And so that's when we hone into the idea that a kid could really have a learning problem with reading, or specifically related to math. And so understanding where a kid is having roadblocks. Is it just at the physical level? They're not hearing the instructions or seeing what's on the board. Or is it because they feel out of sorts emotionally within the class context? You treat those things very differently from when a kid might have difficulty with certain cognitive skills like memory skills or attention skills versus when they have domain-specific skills. And so there's different interventions based on the precision that we have to diagnose what it means to have a math problem or a language problem, for example. And if we look at these domain-specific areas, there's really only 6 different categories when we're talking about math, for example, and 6 different categories when we're talking about language. In the easiest sense, again, we go back to this bigger model, the things that we can observe versus how you break down language into those smaller networks. That's a really key piece of all of this. And so observable behavior is one thing, but understanding what networks aren't working is really the key to the right intervention. And so bringing this up with teachers, it's really interesting. It takes less than an hour to actually teach teachers. Here's 16 basic neural networks related to reading. These break down into smaller subnetworks. Can you figure out what's going on with this kid? Almost instantaneously, when you give them the vocabulary, they're very able to articulate, well, this kid does seem to have a working memory problem, or this kid seems to have a problem recognizing symbols, or this kid, instead of just saying general things like, oh, he has a processing problem, which sometimes people can have processing problems, but it's become really typical to label things processing problems without breaking it down to say exactly what type of processing problems are occurring. And so the precision with which we can do this leads to much better interventions on the student's part. And so I'd like you to pause for just a second and just, take a deep breath and just finish these sentences. Neuroconstructivism. What is it that you see? What are you thinking about right now? And what do you wonder? And I'd love you to bring that to class so that we can have a discussion around this general idea of neuroconstructivism. Curriculum and neuroconstructivism are generally well aligned, and that small blip on the radar has to do with division, but otherwise they are very much aligned. And so to sum up, as far as the networks are concerned, the neuroconstructivism is concerned, we talked about 4 types of networks that exist. Those can be broken down into these 16 types of neural networks, but each of those can be broken down into, even furthermore, into other pathways, which is why we get over 100 different networks which were documented in the literature. And so understanding these 4 basic groups is really a good place to start. What we oftentimes recommend to teachers is that there's a scaling up of interventions, right? Is it something physical? If it's not, is it something psychological? And if it's not psychological, then could it be something cognitive? Scale up to that, because presuming that a kid has a language problem or a math problem leads to all kinds of other problems, because typically speaking, that kind of labels a kid, and labels tend to be pretty negative in terms of learning outcomes. Not to mention that it also leads to inaccurate interventions. So the final big idea here has to do with the word radical, the radical neuroconstructivism in this. And this has to do with the dynamics. We know that teachers are super aware that those kids are coming to class with different cultural norms, and they already have their own communities, and they have different societies, including social media contacts, and they have their families, and all of this influences the learner, right, and what the student brings to class. And we also know that the teacher, also comes with their lived experience, and they have a curriculum that they need to teach, and they have these knowledge and skills and attitudes that they're hoping to get across with the students. What we oftentimes fail to do, especially when we're looking at neuroscientific studies that look at single brains at a time, is that we're forgetting that that pedagogical process doesn't just naturally lead to learning, right? Mainly because, this is the radical part of the whole idea, is it's not just one student. There are dozens of students in our class, and those multiple different types of students influence each other. They influence you. So radical means this iterative growth between the teacher and the learner. And so the students are coming to class and they already know something, right? And then the teacher shares some information, right? And then the students are taking in what the teacher says at very different levels, but they're getting it, right? But then some other student might have an idea that they give back. And that in turn will change how everybody else thinks about that information, including the teacher. And so a key element here is to understand the radical element of radical neuroconstructivism is that it means that we are all always influencing each other and each other's learnings here. And when we talk about the value of having a good classroom environment, that's basically what we're getting at, right? How is it that we facilitate the right kinds of conversations between students and with students so that we're able to have the right kinds of exchanges that really crystallize that information for the students in the right way possible. Finally, the very last big concept is that if radical neuroconstructivism works, if that happens, then we get to a point where kids have made meaning. They understand their world. It's how we interpret and process situations and events and objects and other people and discourses and learn about ourselves in context, in the real world. And so it's how people look at what's happened to them in the past and their own histories and whatever cultural artifacts they're carrying with them and how they interpret the new information that might be happening in class. Okay, so meaning making is a huge part of the benefits of successful radical neuroconstructivism. Okay, meaning making is what is so cool, is taking this kind of black box that we used to have in the 70s of saying somebody teaches and then somebody learns. Well, it's actually saying, okay, what's going on in the middle there is that we're negotiating, the development of identities in context, and it's individual memories put into different cultural contexts and how different people are interpreting things based on what the other is saying about that and how that makes us feel and the conceptual understandings that grow out of those things. And so all of that together, that meaning making, ends up being learning. I mean, how it is that we learn about our world. And so hopefully, if we've leveraged radical neuroconstructivism in the best way possible and use this natural learning trajectory, we do reach meaning making for kids. And so it's not just learning a subject, but it's learning about themselves. So to summarize all of this, basically radical neuroconstructivism, this whole idea of breaking these things down into single elements, is really looking at this kid in a much more holistic way. It's this kid in a dynamic exchange within a classroom setting and how different children influence each other's learning and how the teacher influences the learning. But it's also taking into consideration that, that kid came in with a fixed set of genetic makeup and earlier prior experiences that have had an influence on him that can be risk or protective factors in terms of how well they do in an academic setting. So looking at subjects and students and teaching as a holonic activity of having a lot of sub elements that we just need to understand a little bit better will benefit learning outcomes for students. So what did we try to do? The big ideas I hope that you're having as takeaways here has to do with the brain is organized in a neuroconstructivist fashion. Learning occurs as Piaget thought. We're constructing knowledge, but we can't have, this poor scaffolding because we have gaps in core notions or key understandings. So the idea is to have that strong curriculum structure and not allow kids to pass on until they have mastered these basic levels, or to help them, give them more time to fill in those gaps that they might have before we move on. We know that good differentiated education means that you never change the objective. The grades of, the objectives of second grade are always going to be the same. We have to learn how to do subtraction. Doesn't mean that you pass kids on without doing that. It means, though, that we change the way we evaluate and the methods that we use to teach. Some of those kids are going to need more remedial things to make sure that those core notions are in place before they move on to those higher order ideas, okay? We also know that the neuroconstructivist hierarchy is well aligned with most of our curriculum, so we don't have to rethink what we're teaching. We just have to make sure the kids are mastering it before they move on. And that learning is complex. There's at least these 60 neural networks in these 4 categories that should be known by most teachers. That is key. And if any one of those neural networks isn't in place, the kid isn't going to be able to have those basic skills or in any other subject area be able to move on because they're having gaps in those core notions, right? Another key finding that we had in the research is that teachers are fully capable of getting this. They just aren't exposed to it. And so it's not part of teacher education programs. And we hope that changes in the future as well, right? And finally, this kind of cool idea that everything is really a symbol, pattern, order, category relationship based on the division of these neuroscientific studies that we had also helps us remind ourselves that we can look at the world maybe even a slightly different way. And also motivate our students to do that because they will see connections between them that they hadn't seen before, which would be very beneficial to divergent thinking as well. So I encourage you to have a look at the other video on the 5 pillars of the mind as well. Okay, so to close, I would definitely ask you guys to think a little bit if there was anything that you learned that was new, if there's things that you really want to continue to research or talk about, and if there's anything you might consider changing, would you adopt this? And if you think you'd like to adopt it, but you have a barrier, what is the barrier to adoption so that we can actually try to tear that down when we meet together? Okay, well, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in the live class.